welcome one and all to this evening's session. Kay would start us off.
Yeah.
On acknowledgement.
So we would like to begin by acknowledging members of the Ganyan-Gahaga Nation, the custodians of the land on which we gather today, and the waters that surround it. This island's name is Geojiage. It has historically been and continues to be a gathering place and home for many Indigenous peoples. Today, a diverse group of settlers, Canadians, and people from other nations also gather and live here. I am one of these settler Canadians. As such, I think it is important to further acknowledge that my ancestors, without whom I would not be gathering here today, were not invited here. I gather here today uninvited. Beyond acknowledging territory, then, I think it is important to acknowledge the ongoing colonial contexts in which we all live and in which we are complicit, and emphasize the work that we, the uninvited, must do and continue to do to decolonize. And that is perhaps the best definition of what we're trying to do here this evening. So with that,
what we're trying to do here this evening in the wake of, at the conclusion of our fourth season, as many of you know, but for those who may not, the fourth season of our reading group, which Jocelyn and I started last year in the wake of our participation in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report reading group. As a result of which we wanted to keep learning. We were really excited about the idea of having found some sense of common identity in the notion of treaty people. And so we started the group called Readings for Treaty People. And we've read some early post-Confederation, pre-contact and post-Confederation treaties. We read through lots of amendments of the Indian Act. We read through and around the James Bay Agreement, 1975 James Bay Agreement. And in the process have come to understand that not everyone on these lands identify as treaty people. We've come to understand that the history of treaty making in Canada is in many ways a history of betrayals. And that really so much more of what we identify as doing together, the objective of which is decolonizing, as decolonization, and in search of what that might mean, we have changed our name a little bit. So now the project is now reading to decolonize. And Kay's going to tell us, introduce you to a bit of what we're just concluding, but yeah, please.
all right. I'm going to read.
You're going to read.
Wonderful. So the session, which most of you attended, but for those of you who did not, the session we did over the last 5 weeks was called Conflict in Wet'suwet'en, and it focused on the RCMP raid and the recent struggles at the Unistaden camp in Wet'suwet'en territory on the west coast. We looked at the long history of resistance to asserted crown sovereignty and extractionist capitalism that had been painstakingly built up by the Unistaden and the Wet'suwet'en Nation more broadly. This included readings from the Delgamuukw decision, selections from commentators that addressed questions of Aboriginal rights and title under crown sovereignty, news articles to update us and keep us up to date on what is going on the ground in Unistaden right now, and interrogations into the shapes that colonialism and decolonization are taking today. So understanding the specifics of the conflict in Wet'suwet'en is important, but in order to understand the full impact of these details, it is imperative to understand the long-standing colonial context in which they are taking place. In a nutshell, the impacts of the ongoing assertion of crown sovereignty. To bring our current session to a close then, and to open pathways to deeper learning today and in the future, we are honored to be joined by Professor Karen Drake, member of the Métis Nation of Ontario and Associate Professor and Director of Indigenous Outreach at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. Professor Drake's research focuses on just that, how Canadian law affects Indigenous peoples, the intersections of liberalism and Aboriginal rights, and the role that constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights play in reconciliation. She also studies Anishinaabe law, Métis law, property law, and dispute resolution. She is a commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission and a member of the board of directors of the Human Rights Legal Support Centre. She has served on the board of directors of the Indigenous Bar Association and on the Thunder Bay Métis Council. Professor Drake is a founding faculty member of the Lakehead Faculty of Law and a founding co-editor-in-chief of the Lakehead Law Journal, and is co-editor of a brand new book, Renewing Relationships, Indigenous Peoples in Canada, that has just been released this year, just a few days ago, just last week, from the Native Law Centre at the University of Saskatchewan. Professor Drake's talk tonight is entitled The Rights of Indigenous People in the Context of Asserted Crown Sovereignty. There it is. We are very grateful to her and to everyone here for coming tonight and for contributing, we hope, to the Unistaden Camp Legal Fund, which is, if you would like to make a donation tonight, any money that we receive will go, 100% of the proceeds will go to the Unistaden Camp, from whom we had consent to donate the funds from tonight. That would be greatly appreciated. And we are also grateful to the Atwater Library for hosting and co-presenting this series, and to the Cole Foundation for financing that they contribute to this project. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Drake.
Anin, bonjour, good evening everyone. Thank you, Kay, very much for that introduction. I want to thank Jocelyn Parr and Richard Cassidy for the invitation to be here, and also others who are involved with the Reading to Decolonize project. I'm very grateful to be here in Tiohtià:ke in the territory of the Kinaxake Nation. And I'm very grateful to each of you for this opportunity to engage with you this evening. So, as Kay mentioned, I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. On my mother's side, my family are settlers from Germany and Sweden. On my father's side, my family are settlers from Finland, and also Anishinaabe from the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, and also Métis. Okay, so Indigenous rights are increasingly in the media in Canada. And some recent high-profile examples include ones that you've been talking about, the Unestitan and Coastal GasLink pipeline dispute, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and Site C Dam, just to name a few. So I use the term Indigenous on my slides, but you're going to hear me use the term Aboriginal a lot throughout this talk. And the reason for that is because when we talk about the rights of Indigenous people, we're talking about constitutionally protected rights. Rights are protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act, and the legal term that's used there is the term Aboriginal. Right? So although Indigenous is the more popular term, the term Aboriginal is a legally defined term, and so when we're using it in a legal context, it's the correct term. So many Canadians have questions and concerns about Aboriginal rights. So why do Aboriginal peoples have constitutionally protected rights? So within the Canadian legal system, what it means for something to be a constitutional right means that it is at the top of the hierarchy of our legal system. Right? So our legal system, at the very top is the Constitution, below that is legislation, and then below that is the common law, in other words, judge-made law or court decisions. And when I say it's a hierarchy, what I mean is that the levels above trump the ones below. Right? So something that is a constitutional right trumps legislation. For it to be constitutional means that the legislature cannot override it. Right? That any constitutionally protected right will prevail over any legislation that conflicts with it. So people wonder, why do Aboriginal peoples have these rights that prevail over legislation? And in our time together today, I want to take these questions and concerns seriously. And I hope to do that by stating them at their highest. And I want to state them at their highest so that I can respond to them in their most robust form. So, if you think that my characterization of any of these concerns falls short of this in any way, I want you to feel free to push push back. I want you to feel free to problematize what I say, to critique what I offer. So I characterize these concerns about Aboriginal rights into two overarching categories. The first one starts from the position of asking, why do Indigenous rights exist? Why do Indigenous peoples have what seems to be special rights? And I think that some people are concerned that Indigenous peoples are receiving special treatment or extra benefits, or perhaps it might be put in terms of more than their fair share. And as I said, I want to take this sentiment seriously and state it at its highest. And when we do that, I think that we can understand this as an appeal to liberalism. So there's no definitive articulation or version of liberalism, and the very most I'm going to be able to do is give you a description in a few sentences, and it's necessarily going to be a little bit reductionist. So again, feel free to push back if you think that my characterization of liberalism is not charitable enough. But essentially, liberalism is based on the twin pillars of individual freedom and individual equality. And the concern here, I see, as being in terms of individual or Aboriginal rights seem to violate the principle of individual equality, because they are rights that are not available equally to all Canadian citizens. Only a subset of the Canadian population are entitled to exercise Aboriginal rights, right? Therefore, from that perspective, they violate the principle of equality. And of course, the principle of equality is one of the foundational pillars of our modern liberal democratic society. And so if Aboriginal rights violate the principle of equality, that's a real problem for our community. So that's our first question. Do Aboriginal rights violate the principle of equality? Okay, so the next concern I understand to be about history. The issue is that the grievances that Indigenous peoples are concerned with are said to be ancient history. So they're based on events that happened centuries ago. And so people often, I hear people say that there's no point in getting fixated on the past. Indigenous peoples need to move on. That we should focus on moving forward and look towards a positive future instead of getting mired in the past. And I think that a related critique here is that we're not entitled to judge the events of the past by today's values and standards, right? I also hear that often as well, and again, I want to take these seriously. And the point here is that if we do that, if we try to judge things that happened centuries ago by today's values and today's standards, then we're engaging in anachronistic reasoning, right? That's a fallacy. We're not entitled to do that. And again, if we state this criticism at its highest, I think we can also understand it as an appeal to liberalism. So, according to some prominent versions of liberalism, especially those that are derived from the works of John Rawls, history doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't matter who first acquired sovereignty over some piece of land, and it doesn't matter how they acquired sovereignty over land. The reason is because, according to at least some versions of liberalism, the legitimacy of the liberal state is based on the ability of the state to distribute social goods, benefits, and rights equally to its citizens, now in the present day. And so as long as the distribution of social rights, social goods, and benefits upholds the principle of individual equality, then the state is justified, right? That's all we need to look towards in order to know whether the state is justified. And it doesn't matter how that state came to be, as long as in the present day, it's upholding that equal distribution of social goods and benefits. Okay, so to address these two concerns, we first need to understand something about the foundation of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. And as an entry point into that relationship, I want to begin by borrowing an anecdote that David Foster Wallace gave in his commencement address at Kenyon College in 2005. And I've heard many other people use this little anecdote as well, including Gordon Christie, a professor at UBC's Faculty of Law. So this is the anecdote. There are two young fish who are swimming along, and they swim by an older fish. And the older fish says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two younger fish kind of look at each other, and they keep swimming, and they swim past the older fish. And then they look at each other, and one says to the other, "What the heck is water?" Okay, so the point that I want to make with this anecdote is that every legal system exists within and is constrained by a particular worldview. And by worldview, I mean our most basic assumptions about reality. So in other words, our epistemology, our ontology, our cosmology. But it can be immensely challenging to appreciate this point, right? It's easy to say, but it's immensely challenging to actually live it, that every legal system exists only within a worldview. Because our worldview is the water. We take it for granted. It normally goes unquestioned, unexamined. The reason for that is because it's the precondition for our social, political, and legal system. So because our entire social structure rests on our worldview, it can be easy to assume that there's no other possibility, that there's no other way of structuring our reality. In other words, it can be difficult to see how there could be a world outside of our water. Okay, so a key take-home point for this evening is that at least some Indigenous nations have a worldview that's fundamentally different from a Western liberal worldview. And if we ignore this, then the result is that we end up interpreting the actions, the laws, the norms, the values of Indigenous peoples from a Western worldview, if that's all that we have to bring to bear. That's the only lens that we have to examine what Indigenous peoples are doing or saying. The result will then be distortions, misunderstandings, misconceptions of Indigenous peoples, their laws, their perspectives. Okay, so to begin to understand the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada, we have to know something about these different worldviews. We need to find a way to grasp onto the water without letting it slip through our fingers. Okay, so I want to start by giving credit to Professor Aaron Mills. He's an assistant professor at McGill's Faculty of Law, and as of July 1st, he's taken up the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Constitutionalism and Philosophy at McGill. He's also a Anishinaabe from Couchiching First Nation in Treaty 3 territory, which is the same treaty where my father's family, where their community is, Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. So what I'm going to talk about on the next slide comes from what I've learned from Aaron Mills and his work, and so I provided the citations here. Okay, so what I want to do next is compare liberal constitutionalism with Anishinaabe constitutionalism. And when I talk about constitution and constitutionalism, often what comes to mind are founding documents and things like the Charter. Right? So that refers to one version of constitutionalism. But what Mills talks about, when he talks about constitutionalism, is something more fundamental, more basic, which is how a people constitutes itself politically. And so we can understand not just Western nations as engaging in constitutionalism, but as Indigenous nations as well. And what I'm going to do, drawing on the work of Aaron Mills, is compare liberal constitutionalism with Anishinaabe constitutionalism. And the reason why I'm focusing on Anishinaabe Nation, the Anishinaabe people in particular, is because that's what I've been able to learn from Aaron Mills, and that's his family, and that's my family on my father's side as well. And it's also a way of avoiding a pan-Indigenous approach, right? It's a way of avoiding lumping all Indigenous peoples together and assuming that all of their norms, their legal systems, are interchangeable or homogeneous. Okay, so let's start with a liberal constitution. So again, if you feel this is reductionist, please feel free to push back and problematize what I say. So I started by talking about the twin pillars of liberalism being individual equality and individual freedom. And these I see as being based on a more fundamental underlying principle, which is the notion that the individual is the rights bearer, right? It's the individual who is the one who holds and exercises rights within society. And an even more fundamental assumption that underlies this is the discourse of rights. right? The notion that the currency of our legal system is rights and obligations. And Mills characterizes that in terms of a contract relationship. Right? So whenever there's a right, that means that corresponding to that right is some duty, or in other words, obligation or responsibility. And this is easy to understand in the context of individual relationships, but within liberalism, it also characterizes the relationship between the individual and the state. And classical liberalists go so far as to talk about the social contract. And our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is our modern instantiation of these liberal principles, and in particular of the principles of individual freedom and individual equality. Now we can contrast this with Anishinaabe constitutionalism. The starting point here isn't the individual, it isn't individual autonomy. The starting point instead is interdependence. Now again, just as I can't possibly do justice to liberalism within a few sentences, the same applies to what I'm going to speak to you about in terms of Anishinaabe constitutionalism. So I want to warn you that, again, this will also seem reductionist, and that the Anishinaabe perspective is much richer and nuanced than what I can convey to you in this short period of time. Okay, so as Mills explains it, from interdependence, what follows is not a contractual relationship, but rather a relationship characterized by mutual aid. And here, the key point to take from this is that whereas contract is based within a notion of rights and obligations, the logical structure of mutual aid isn't based around rights. It's based around gifts and needs. So this can be, again, difficult to appreciate, because within Anishinaabe constitutionalism, within Anishinaabe perspectives on mutual aid, the notion of responsibilities plays a big role, right? So the key is that within any relationship, we have an obligation to understand what our responsibilities are. And once we do that, we need to understand what the needs are of the other person in the relationship, and to assess what gifts we have, and to do our best to ensure that our gifts are going to be able to fulfill the needs of others, and to build up our gifts, to be able to do that, to be able to contribute to our community and to others that we're in a relationship with. So because responsibilities play such a large role within this notion of mutual aid, and because responsibilities are, within the English language, often taken to be synonyms with duties or obligations, it can be easy to assume that rights have some role to play within Anishinaabe constitutionalism, right? Because on the other side of responsibilities within liberalism are rights. However, that would be a misconception. Okay, so yes, responsibilities are a key aspect of Anishinaabe constitutionalism, but within the Anishinaabe perspective, what's on the other side of responsibilities are not rights. Instead, what's on the other side are gifts and needs. Okay, so there's so much that follows from this. Again, I can't do all of it justice, but just to touch on some of it. A key thing to understand about responsibilities from within an Anishinaabe perspective is that they can't be determined from the outset, up front, for all time going forward. Relationships are dynamic, they're organic, they grow, they change over time. Gifts change over time, needs change over time. Relationships must be regularly revisited. It's necessary to continually assess what your gifts are, what your needs are, what are the needs of others whom you're in a relationship with, right? What are the needs of your relations, of your community? So what this means is that it would be very difficult within an Anishinaabe perspective to set up a charter of rights and freedom, right? That we have in the liberal perspective, where we can articulate from the outset, essentially going forward for all time, what are our rights. So this framework applies not just to relationships amongst individuals, but it also applies to treaties. It is also the way in which treaties work. And for instance, Leanne Simpson talks about this in her article, Looking After Godot Naganana. And the term that she uses is Chinabakanagewan. And this is an Anishinaabe-Moan term, which refers to an open agreement with matters to be added to it. And the point she's making here is that this is how treaties are characterized. Treaties are open agreements with matters to be added to them. It doesn't mean that they're unfinished. Instead, what it means is that they are ongoing, reciprocal, dynamic relationships that are to be nurtured, maintained over time. Right? They change, they develop, they grow. And her point is that treaties amongst Indigenous peoples work this way, but it's not just treaties amongst Indigenous peoples, that from an Anishinaabe perspective, treaties entered into with Europeans are also characterized in this way, from an Anishinaabe perspective. So again, a treaty is not like a contract where all of the terms are decided up front in one document and spelled out, and then those terms are going to govern for all time. Okay, so with this brief background in mind, let's turn to the foundation of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. And to do this, we can ask ourselves, how does Canada justify its assertion of sovereignty over Indigenous peoples? So at international law, there are 4 possible modes of acquiring sovereignty over foreign territory that are potentially applicable in what is now Canada. And I'm going to go through each of them in turn. The first is discovery, the second is conquest, the third is prescription, which means through the passage of time, and the fourth is cession, which refers to a transfer of sovereignty through treaties. So our question here is, which one of these, if any, apply in Canada? And when we figure out which one apply in Canada, we can also ask ourselves, does it uphold the principle of equality? Right? So if one of the concerns that is voiced about Aboriginal rights is that they potentially violate the principle of equality, we can ask ourselves, does Canada's assertion of sovereignty uphold the principle of equality? Okay, so the first is the doctrine of discovery. So according to this way of acquiring sovereignty, a state can gain sovereignty over foreign territory by being the first to discover it. So the key here, though, is that in order for this doctrine to work, the territory has to be empty, in the sense that there's no other people in that territory. And the legal term that's used for this is a Latin term, terra nullius, which just means empty land. Right? So terra means land, nullius means empty. So Europeans applied different versions of this doctrine in different locations in different periods of time. And on some accounts, it was necessary for a state to simply arrive in empty territory and claim it. On other versions, it was necessary to engage in some declarative acts. So for instance, planting a flag in the territory or putting a cross in the territory. And on some counts, it was necessary to also effectively occupy the territory. And what that meant was fill the territory with your citizens, or in other words, your settlers, and to establish courts and police forces that were in a position to then enforce laws over the territory. Okay, but you might be wondering, why are we talking about the doctrine of discovery at all with respect to North America? Because obviously what's now North America wasn't empty or terra nullius when Europeans arrived, because Indigenous peoples, of course, were here. So from the outset, it seems that the doctrine of discovery shouldn't be applicable. The reason we're talking about it is because Europeans modified the doctrine when it comes to applying it to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous territories. So they modified it to make it applicable to Indigenous territories despite the existence of Indigenous people, and then applied it to places like North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay, so what did it mean to apply the doctrine of discovery in North America? The classic articulation of the doctrine of discovery comes from a decision called Johnson and McIntosh from the United States Supreme Court. And essentially, what this decision says is that just by arriving here, Europeans were entitled to assert sovereignty over this territory vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples. And by virtue of Europeans arriving here, Indigenous peoples instantaneously lost their sovereignty. So the justification for this was that Europeans deemed indigenous peoples to be inferior to Europeans. And many different rationalizations were put forward to justify this assertion of the inferiority of indigenous peoples. And some of the justifications are interrelated. So in Johnson and McIntosh, one of the justifications that's given is that indigenous peoples were not Christian. Another justification that's given is that they were not quote-unquote civilized. Another justification that was given, not in the Johnson and McIntosh decision, but in philosophical writings, so for instance in the writings of John Locke, is that indigenous peoples did not use their land in such a way that constitutes ownership or sovereignty over it. So this is the labor theory of land. And according to this theory articulated by Locke, if there is property that is held in common, so if we have some commons, then if individuals mix their labor with it sufficiently, the land, the property, is taken out of the commons and becomes their private property. Now, according to a Western perspective, indigenous peoples simply didn't do this. The things that indigenous peoples did on their land weren't sufficient to constitute mixing their labor with the land. So, for instance, they didn't build permanent structures, according to this viewpoint. They didn't put fences around their territory. They didn't engage in agriculture. Now, some of those assumptions are factually incorrect, but those are the assumptions used to defend the notion that indigenous peoples didn't sufficiently invest their labor into the land in order to be able to claim it as their land. Okay, so when indigenous people lost their sovereignty, according to this perspective, by virtue of Europeans arriving, what were they left with? They were left with certain limited rights. They were left with the right to occupy their land and to use it for limited purposes. But they didn't own their land and they didn't have underlying title to it. So these rights of occupation and use, these very limited rights, are what then developed into our modern doctrine of Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title. So the Doctrine of Discovery says that indigenous peoples go from being sovereign over their territory to being mere occupants on their land. In other words, they go from exercising jurisdiction, of having laws over their territory, to then having very limited rights to the territory. So it's not just that their rights get shrunk, it's that there's a category shift, right? They go from being in the category of sovereign over their territory, and Johnson and McIntosh does recognize that, right? That decision explicitly recognizes that before Europeans arrived, indigenous peoples are here living without interference, sovereign over their territory. But that sovereignty essentially disappears by virtue of Europeans arriving here. Okay, so now we can ask ourselves, does the Doctrine of Discovery provide a compelling justification for Canada's assertion of sovereignty? And I'm going to suggest that the answer is no, because it violates the principle of equality. So it's based on the assumption that indigenous peoples are inferior to European peoples, as I mentioned. And it's been rejected at international law. And the inequality that's inherent in the Doctrine of Discovery is also illustrated by the fact that it didn't apply in the reverse, right? It didn't apply equally to Europeans. Right? According to this doctrine, Europeans were only entitled to use it in order to acquire the territory of indigenous peoples. But indigenous peoples couldn't use the Doctrine of Discovery to go and acquire the territory of Europeans. Right? So for instance, indigenous peoples couldn't go to London and put some tobacco down in front of Buckingham Palace and then claim to be sovereign over all of Britain. I know because indigenous peoples have tried this and it didn't work, right? So I've heard stories of people actually going and doing this and putting their tobacco down and saying, well, I guess I'm sovereign over all of Britain now. But Britons didn't go for it, right? They didn't say, oh, you got us, I guess you're sovereign over us now, good one. No, they didn't do that. It just didn't work. Okay, so the Doctrine of Discovery violates the principle of equality. But are there any better explanations for Canada's assertion of sovereignty? Let's talk about conquest. So conquest means what you think it does. It refers to the principle that if two countries engage in war, the one that wins or conquers the other is entitled to claim sovereignty over the conquered territory and its inhabitants. There's a common misconception that at some point in the past, Britain or perhaps France conquered Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And that's how those nations and now Canada have the right to exercise sovereignty here. Or at least that's the basis for Canada's claim to sovereignty. And this misconception is so prevalent that in the last, I'd say just over a year ago, I heard a former Supreme Court of Canada judge articulate this view, that this is how Canada has come to be sovereign. Or at least it's the explanation within Canadian law as to how Canada has sovereignty here. This is incorrect, okay? If there's one thing you can take from this evening, it's that from the perspective of Canadian law itself, from within Canadian law, conquest has never been the legal explanation as to how Canada has sovereignty in this territory. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized this in 3 recent decisions. All right, so the Supreme Court has said that, put simply, Canada's Aboriginal peoples were here when Europeans came and were never conquered. And in 3 different decisions, they give this quote. And they're right. So in all respects, Canada treated Indigenous peoples as a conquered people. So there are a number of different consequences, legally, of a conquest. And one of them has to do with how law comes to operate in the territory. So if there is a conquered colony, for instance, then the law of the conquered people continues to exist, it remains in place, until it's altered by the new sovereign. We can contrast that with if we have a settled territory, in other words, if there's territory that's acquired by discovery, the doctrine of discovery that we just talked about, then the way in which British law comes to be effective is through something called the Doctrine of Reception. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but suffice it to say that within Canadian law, the explanation as to how British law came to apply here, other than in territories where there's conquest between Britain and France, but in all other territories, the way in which British law comes to apply is through the Doctrine of Reception. In other words, because this is a discovered territory, not because there was a conquest of Indigenous peoples. Okay, so why is this the case? Why is it that there's not a conquest of Indigenous peoples? And that the court recognizes this and has never claimed that there has been. So the first reason is just because factually there never was an actual conquest of Indigenous peoples by European nations. There was no grand war where either Britain or France fought Indigenous peoples and won, right? And actually conquered Indigenous peoples. That just didn't happen. So in terms of what are the possibilities where we might have thought that this happened, we can take, for instance, the 7 Years' War. So here we have a war happening between 1756 and 1763. And we have various European nations throughout the world engaged in this conflict, but within the territory that's now North America, we have Britain and France fighting for control over their claims to territory here. And we have First Nations fighting on either side with them. So we have the Haudenosaunee fighting along with the British, and we have the Anishinaabe fighting along with France. And of course, Britain eventually conquers France's territories here. So then, that leads to the question, does that mean that Britain also conquered the Anishinaabe, who are fighting along with France? Or, another way we can put the argument is that people will sometimes assert that, well, even if there never was a conquest, even if Britain, and subsequently Canada, never did conquer Indigenous peoples, surely they could now. Now, Canada has the military ability and strength, if it wanted to conquer all Indigenous peoples now. So isn't that the same? Isn't that sufficient? Okay, so let's examine both of those questions. To do that, we first need to know that conquest is not merely a political concept or a political doctrine, it's a legal doctrine. And there's a legal test that has to be met in order for conquest legally to have occurred. And there are 3 requirements at international law for there to be a conquest. The first is that a state of war has to exist between the relevant nations. So just because 2 nations are engaged in hostilities, that doesn't mean that they're in a state of war. So for there to be a state of war, there has to be some intention exhibited on the part of the Crown to be in a state of war with that other nation. So for instance, there has to be a declaration of war against that other nation. So the key here is that merely being in a position to perhaps exert control over another nation doesn't constitute being in a state of war with them. Okay, the second requirement is that the nation that claims to be the conquering nation has to actually subjugate the vanquished state. So, in other words, you have to actually win the war if you want to claim to be the conquering nation. It's not enough to say, well, we could have won the war if we wanted to, or we could win the war if we really want to. You have to actually subjugate the vanquished state. And the third requirement is that the conquering state has to manifest an intention to extend its sovereignty over the conquered territory. So normally this is done by entering into a surrender treaty, right? So the vanquished state will sign a treaty ceding sovereignty to the conquering nation. So normally treaties and conquest go hand in hand. It doesn't need to happen through a treaty though, it could happen unilaterally. So the conquering nation could unilaterally issue a proclamation asserting its sovereignty over the conquered territory. Okay, so these are conjunctive. All three of them must be satisfied in order for there to be a conquest. So let's apply these to the 7 Years' War. So following the 7 Years' War, France signs the surrender treaty, the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And in doing so, France admits defeat and cedes its colonies in North America to Britain. However, none of the First Nations who fought on the side of France signed the Treaty of Paris. Right? So the Anishinaabe, who fought on the side of France, they didn't sign the Treaty of Paris, admitting defeat. They didn't sign any treaty with Britain, admitting defeat and ceding or surrendering sovereignty to Britain. So, despite this, Britain initially assumed that its conquest of France's claims meant that it also conquered the Anishinaabe. And so, prior to the 7 Years' War, France had participated in a legal institution of gift-giving with the Anishinaabe. Right? So the French were in Anishinaabe territory, and they regularly gave gifts to the Anishinaabe. So this is an instantiation of the principle of gifts and needs and mutual aid that I talked about, right? An actual literal giving of gifts. And the French did that. They participated in this Anishinaabe legal institution. So after the 7 Years' War, though, the British didn't. They just didn't give gifts. They just didn't think that they needed to. They thought that they had conquered the Anishinaabe as well. However, from the Anishinaabe perspective, they hadn't been conquered at all. And so when the British refused to give gifts, to participate, and to abide by their own laws, the Anishinaabe laws, the Anishinaabe rose up again. Right? So we have Chief Pontiac, who resumes fighting against the British. And one of the Anishinaabe chiefs explicitly says to the British, so here we have Chief Minavavana from Michilimackinac, and he says to the British, Englishmen, you've conquered the French, but you've not conquered us. We are still at war. So what this shows is that, arguably, Britain didn't meet the second requirement of conquest. It didn't actually subjugate the Anishinaabe. So then what does Britain do in order to make peace, right? They're at war again with the Anishinaabe, so how do they deal with that? Well, they do two things. First, the British King issues the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Royal Proclamation was written only in English. What it does is it sets aside a huge swath of land and provides that that land is reserved for First Nations. It also says that for the rest of the land within the territory claimed by Britain, that if any settlers want to settle within the land, in order to do so, they first must receive a surrender from the First Nations. In other words, it's not possible to simply go and claim the land. So what this does is it provides protection, it provides the foundation for Aboriginal rights. That being said, the Royal Proclamation also assumes that Britain is sovereign over all of this claimed territory. So it's a conflicting doctrine. It purports to provide these very robust protections for Aboriginal rights, but also assumes that Britain has sovereignty over this territory. Now that's not the only thing, or even the most important thing though, that Britain did. More significantly, we have the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. So after the king issues the Royal Proclamation in 1763, then Britain asks members of the Algonquin Nation and the Nipissing Nation to serve as runners and to go out and summons all of the First Nations within the territory that Britain is claiming at this point. And so they do that. And so during the winter of 1763 to 1764, members of the Algonquin Nation and Nipissing Nation, they travel throughout the Northeast, Mideast, and Midwest of British North America. And all the First Nations they come to, they give them strings of wampum and say, the British are summoning us. Come to a meeting at Niagara this summer. So it's important to recognize here that it's not the First Nations going to Britain asking for a peace. It's the other way around. Right? Britain is coming to the First Nations, asking them to come to a peace council. Okay, so then we have the summer of 1764 at Niagara. So this was, as of 2014, 250 years ago. So what happens here is we have approximately 2,000 First Nations chiefs gathered together. They had come from as far east as Nova Scotia, as far west as Mississippi, and as far north as Hudson's Bay. And some First Nations chiefs had traveled for months to be there. What happens at this meeting, first we have Sir William Johnson, who is the representative of the British, and he starts by reading out the Royal Proclamation. First Nations, of course, did not read English at this time, and the majority of them didn't speak English. So that's not the only thing, though, that Sir William Johnson does. Instead, he also has wampum belts. So what are wampum? So wampum are shells that can be, you can drill a hole through them and put strings through them. And by using different colors and by attaching the strings together, you can make belts with images on them. And this is a legal institution that was used by a number of indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mi'kmaq. And you can think of these wampum belts as representing treaty agreements. So in other words, the images on the belts represent the different principles within the treaty. So what Sir William Johnson does is he has 2 wampum belts made so that he can offer them to the First Nations who gather at Niagara in 1764. Okay, so the first one is the Great Covenant Chain Belt. So the way that Johnson explains this, he says that this is a chain that will bind all of the Western nations. So the Western nations refers to a number of First Nations, including the Anishinaabe, to the English. And the 2 figures on the belt represent the Western nations, including the Anishinaabe, and the British. And Johnson said he's going to fix one end of the belt at his house, and he asked the First Nations to fix the other end with the Chippewas at St. Mary's, which is modern-day Sault Ste. Marie. However, one of the Anishinaabe chiefs says that no, it's better to put it at Michilimackinac because that is the center of Anishinaabe territory. So Johnson explains that the significance of this belt is that our hands are going to be tied together in bonds of friendship. And here the chain is a chain made of silver. And the reason that Johnson gave for saying that the chain is made of silver is because he thought first, could it be made of rope? But he said, no, rope is not strong enough. And then he thought, could it be made of, however, iron rusts, and it's not as valuable. So he said, the chain is made of silver. However, silver, if it's left alone, tarnishes. It needs to be polished on a regular basis. So the process of renewing the treaty on a regular basis is polishing the chain. What this means is that the parties have a responsibility to meet together regularly. They do so on an annual basis in order to get together in a council, in order to renew their relationship. So what this means is they come together and talk about what's happened over the past year. Do we have any disputes? Do we have any concerns? And it's an opportunity to resolve those. And also to give gifts, right? So now Britain gets brought into this Anishinaabe legal institution, and they give gifts to the Anishinaabe. So they do this for almost 100 years. Right? Starting in 1764 until 1854, the British meet with the Anishinaabe at regularly designated places on an annual basis to renew the relationship, to polish the chain, and to give gifts to the Anishinaabe. So the hexagons represent council fires, or in other words, meeting places. And they also, of course, represent links in the chain. So the diamonds represent nations. And you can see that on the left, there's sort of 1.5 diamonds, and on the right, there's a kind of a half diamond. So the significance of this is that it's not that there's a broken diamond, but that this is in fact a belt, right? And you wear a belt in a circle. And so when you put the two ends together, then the diamond is complete. And we have 2 diamonds representing each of the 2 nations. The point here is that there is no start or end to the treaty, that the treaty goes on forever. It's a circle. It's not linear. There is no end point to it. So overall, what this represents is a military, political, and economic alliance of equals. Okay, so this is the first belt. The second belt that Sir William Johnson gives to the Anishinaabe is the 24 Nations belt. And here we have at one end a ship, and in between is a rope, and at the other end is tied to a rock. And the way that Johnson explains the significance of this belt, he says, quote, "This vessel I give you, it shall never be empty, my children. I tie a rope to this vessel, which has become yours. If any day, my children, you see something wanting, I shall say my children are in want of something. I'll go aboard the vessel, I'll try to get what is wanted, and I'll ship it, and when I shall have brought it, you will then draw up your vessel." Okay, so what is he describing here? What is Sir William Johnson getting at when he says this? Well, if we can think about it from inside the perspective of Anishinaabe constitutionalism that I talked about, right? So inside the perspective where what governs our relationship are gifts and needs. This is arguably Johnson inviting the Anishinaabe to enter into a relationship of sharing based on gifts and needs, right? What he's saying is that I'm recognizing needs that you have, and I'm offering the gifts to meet those needs in this ship, right? I'm going to provide a ship that's going to be filled with all the gifts that you could possibly need. And of course, the point here is that he's going to do this in exchange for the British being able to stay in the territory, right? That's the whole point here, is that the Anishinaabe had risen up against the British. We're not allowing them to be in the territory. But the British are going to give all the gifts that the Anishinaabe could ever possibly need so the British can stay in the territory. So here what we can see is the British being governed by Anishinaabe laws. Right? The British are being governed by Anishinaabe legal institutions. The legal institutions of using wampum, but also the principles of a mutual aid relationship, of engaging in recognition of the needs of others and offering gifts to fulfill those needs. So neither of these belts depicts the British imposing control from above. Neither of them depicts the British conquering First Nations, and neither of them represents First Nations admitting defeat or being subjugated by the British. So what these belts show is that Britain's actions on the ground arguably don't satisfy the third requirement of conquest. Right? So it's true that the Royal Proclamation is a unilateral declaration of Britain's sovereignty. However, that intention wasn't exhibited on the ground, face to face, to the Anishinaabe. Instead, the perspective that Britain puts forward on the ground is very different. We see a nation-to-nation relationship reflected in the belts. Now, there are many other examples of force being used in North America, and we could potentially go through all of them and apply these 3 criteria. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to subject you to the entire history of North America and a legal analysis based on conquest. And the reason is we don't have to do that. So we don't have to do that because conquest has never been the legal explanation for Canada's sovereignty. Instead, there's always been a different official legal explanation for Canada's sovereignty. And as I mentioned, the Supreme Court of Canada itself has recognized this in a number of decisions. So the actual explanation within Canadian law is in fact the doctrine of discovery, and it's not conquest. And so the issue here is that you can't have both. You can't both base your claim of sovereignty on the doctrine of discovery and base it on conquest. And for this argument, I'm relying on the work of Kent McNeil, who is Professor Emeritus at Osgoode. And as he explains the common law, if a nation bases its claim to sovereignty on the doctrine of discovery, then there are legal consequences to that. And the legal consequences are that immediately upon a claim to sovereignty, the inhabitants of that territory are deemed to be citizens of the British Crown. Okay, so immediately upon that claim of sovereignty, the original inhabitants, the indigenous people, become, according to the common law, British subjects. Now, according to the British common law, the Crown cannot engage in acts of state against its own citizens. And conquest, an assertion of sovereignty through conquest, is an example of an act of state. So according to the common law itself, you can't both have a claim of sovereignty based on the doctrine of discovery and engage in conquest, because you would be engaging in an act of state against your own citizens, which is prohibited by the common law. Okay, so that eliminates conquest, but we still have a couple more options. The next one is prescription. So prescription is very similar to discovery, but the difference is that discovery was only supposed to apply in empty territory, while prescription does apply to territory that's already occupied. So it seems like it potentially could be a much more attractive and applicable doctrine for Canada. Okay, so what prescription says is that a nation can move into territory that's already occupied by other people, and if the incoming nation occupies that territory and eventually gains control of that territory, and a certain amount of time passes, and a number of other requirements are met as well, then it can legitimately claim to be sovereign over that territory. Okay, so I said that a number of other requirements have to be met as well, though. So one of these requirements is that the original inhabitants have to acquiesce to the incoming nation's claim of sovereignty. And one way that the current inhabitants can show that they do not acquiesce is by engaging in protests, right? So this is part of the legal doctrine. So then we can ask ourselves, have there ever been any examples of indigenous peoples protesting the assertion of sovereignty of Britain and subsequently Canada? So it turns out the answer is a resounding yes, that there are many examples of protests. And I won't take you through all of them, but the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples has done that work for us, and I provide the link for you there, of documenting protests of Indigenous peoples throughout the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Britain and subsequently Canada. Okay, so prescriptions seem like it could have been attractive. Turns out it doesn't actually work for us either. But we still have cession, or in other words, treaties, as a possible option. So what this refers to is that one nation can execute a treaty that states that it surrenders its sovereignty to the other nation, right? Concede its sovereignty to another nation through a treaty. Normally, this happens after conquest, right? I said that normally treaties and conquest go hand in hand. So even though Indigenous peoples in Canada were not conquered, as we discussed, they did actually enter into a number of treaties, though, with Britain and subsequently Canada. So here we have a map of the historical treaties. The ones indicated in purple are the numbered treaties, also referred to as the land surrender treaties. In yellow, we have areas where there are no historical treaties. In green is where we have the peace and friendship treaties. So the peace and friendship treaties were not land surrender treaties, even from the perspective of the written text. Instead, the area covered in green are treaties of alliance, even according to the actual English written text. And then in Southern Ontario, we have a number of treaties which are similar to the numbered treaties, except the only difference essentially is that they're on a much smaller scale. Okay, so we won't go through all of them, but let's just take one treaty as an example. And I like Treaty 9 as an example. So Treaty 9 covers Northern Ontario. So if you can see the purple area in Northern Ontario there. So it covers a huge swath, and it was originally made in 1905, but then there are adhesions to it in 1929 and 1930, as you can see indicated there. Now, the written text of Treaty 9 has a surrender clause. So this is what the written text of the treaty says. It essentially says that the First Nations who signed it are agreeing to surrender, yield, cede, release, give up absolutely and forever all of their rights, titles, privileges whatsoever to the lands that are designated in the treaty. Okay, so according to this written text, is this written text sufficient to effect a surrender of sovereignty within Canadian law? In other words, from the perspective of Canadian law itself, from the perspective even of the written text of the treaty, was this a surrender of sovereignty? Well, we can ask ourselves, what does Treaty 9 say about sovereignty? It turns out it says nothing about sovereignty. The word sovereignty never appears in Treaty 9, and in fact the word is in any of the numbered treaties, in any of the so-called historical land surrender treaties. Okay, that being said, you might think though, this language is so strong and this language is so broad, surely even though it doesn't use the word sovereignty, it's broad enough to cover sovereignty, right? They're agreeing to cede, release, surrender, yield, give up altogether all of their rights, titles, privileges, whatsoever, everything to the land. Isn't that broad enough to include a giving up of sovereignty? So, my answer is no. And the reason is when Britain enters into surrender treaties with other nations, it doesn't mince words. Okay, we have many examples from comparable periods where Britain is accepting surrenders from other nations, and when it does so, it specifically uses the word sovereignty. It doesn't beat around the bush. So for instance, we have the Treaty of Paris I mentioned already of 1763, where Britain says it is explicitly accepting a surrender of sovereignty from France with respect to its claims to territories in the New World. So you might think, okay, well that's fine, that's how Britain conceives of its relationship with other European nations, but perhaps it has a different view with respect to Indigenous nations. Actually, we have a treaty between Britain and Indigenous peoples from New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi of 1840. And although there is another version of this treaty in the Maori language, which includes very different language and does not include the language of a surrender of sovereignty, there are two versions. And the English version does talk about a surrender of sovereignty, right? So when Britain wants to say it's accepting a surrender of sovereignty, it says exactly that. Okay, so the key point is that even from Britain's own perspective, in the numbered treaties, the so-called historical land surrender treaties, Britain did not see itself as accepting a surrender of sovereignty in those treaties. So why is that? Britain could have written that in. They could have written anything in, right? Because the Indigenous peoples weren't able to read the treaties. They didn't read English at that time. Most of them didn't speak English either. The treaties were entered into through interpreters and orally. So Britain could have written anything, but they didn't write in a surrender of sovereignty. They didn't want to, and they didn't need to from their perspective. It wasn't necessary for Britain to get a surrender of sovereignty in the treaties because the doctrine of discovery was always their legal explanation as to how they got sovereignty. From Britain's perspective, they had sovereignty for centuries already. They had sovereignty just by arriving here. So what was being extinguished then in the treaties, according to Britain's own perspective? Well, what was being extinguished was just those leftovers that I talked about from the doctrine of discovery, right? So remember I said that when Europeans arrived, from Europeans' perspective, Indigenous peoples weren't left with absolutely nothing. They were left with some minimal limited rights, the right to occupy their land and the right to use their land, and that those minimal rights are what has developed into the doctrine of Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights that we have today. That's what, from Britain's perspective, is being extinguished in the treaties. Just those leftover minimal rights. Britain never saw itself as accepting a surrender of sovereignty in the treaties. So that's Britain's perspective. But what about the perspective of the First Nations who signed the treaties? What did the First Nations who signed Treaty 9 think that they were agreeing to? So, as I mentioned, none of the three commissioners who entered into Treaty 9 on behalf of Canada and Ontario spoke the Cree or Ojibwe language, which was the languages spoken by the First Nations who entered into Treaty 9. And the First Nations did not speak English. So this was all conducted through translators. So at each community, how did the translator explain what the treaty was about? How did the translator explain what Canada was asking for? Well, it turns out that we have a really explicit explanation as to what they were asking for. We have Duncan Campbell Scott, who was one of the 3 commissioners. He was there on behalf of Canada. And he describes in an article he wrote called The Last of the Indian Treaties exactly what he told the translators to tell the First Nations. This is what he writes. The First Nations were to make certain promises, and we were to make certain promises. But our purpose and our reasons were alike unknowable. What could they grasp of the pronouncement of the Indian tenure which had been delivered by the law lords of the Crown? Nothing. So there was no basis for argument. The simpler facts had to be stated, and the parental idea developed that the king is the great father of the Indians, watchful over their interests and ever compassionate. After gifts of tobacco, as we were seated in a circle in a big room of Hudson's Bay Company, the interpreter delivered this message. Okay, so what is he saying there? What exactly is he getting at? Well, what he's saying, he's admitting that there is no way for him to explain to the First Nations that Britain already had sovereignty over your territory, even though you've never met us before. This is the first time we've ever shown up here, but we've already had sovereignty over this territory for centuries. However, you still have something left over. It's this thing called Indian title. You don't know what that means, you've never heard of it before, but that's what your rights are. And we've got this document for you to sign, and the significance of it is that you are giving up that Indian title, right? He's saying there's no way we could have explained all of that to them. They wouldn't have understood. So instead, he told them that the king wants to take care of them and to give them gifts. He's here on behalf of the king. The king wants to offer you gifts and to take care of you. So what would that have meant to the First Nations? Well, Rachel Harris and John Cutfeet have written an excellent book called Keeping the Land. And they explain from the perspective of the First Nations of Treaty 9 that land is not the kind of thing that can be surrendered or sold. Instead, land has its own agency. We're in a relationship with land. Land is a member of our community. It's one of our relations. And we have responsibilities to it in just the same way that we have responsibilities to our family and to the members of our community. And if we were to try to sell the land, it would be like trying to sell one of our friends and family members, right? It would just be impossible. We can't do that. It's human trafficking, right? You can't sell your friends and family members. You also can't sell the land. So what were the First Nations agreeing to? Well, when the offer is an offer of gifts and an offer to be taken care of, that's an invitation to enter into this relationship of mutual aid that I've been talking about. Right? It's an offer to coexist together on the land. It's an offer for the British to be able to accept the gifts of the land, and in exchange, the British offer gifts to the First Nations. In other words, it's a political alliance of equals, similar to what we saw in the Treaty of Niagara. So again, it's important not to overgeneralize. However, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples back in the 90s, based on its extensive research, so 5 years of research and over 6 volumes of work, they conclude that this understanding is consistent across Canada on the part of First Nations. That First Nations understood Britain and subsequently Canada to be asking for a relationship to share in the gifts of the land and to enter into a relationship of mutual aid. Okay, so to summarize, treaties from both the British and from an Anishinaabe perspective don't affect the surrender of sovereignty. So we've gone through each of the 4 modes of acquiring sovereignty, and the only explanation that fits the Canadian context is the Doctrine of Discovery. And as I mentioned, it is in fact the official explanation. So although we looked at Johnson-McIntosh, which is a US decision from 1823, modern Supreme Court of Canada decisions have affirmed and adopted the passages in Johnson and McIntosh that articulate the doctrine of discovery. Okay, so modern Supreme Court of Canada decisions say that the doctrine of discovery is our explanation for how Canada has sovereignty here. And I've given you the citations. So one is Guerin and another is Sparrow. All right, so that brings us back to our two guiding questions. And let's talk about the second one first. This notion that Indigenous concerns are merely history, and the related critique that we're not entitled to judge the events of the past from centuries ago by today's values and today's standards. And to do so is to engage in anachronistic reasoning. But as I just said, the Supreme Court of Canada, in modern decisions, has explicitly adopted Johnson and McIntosh. In other words, the logic of the doctrine of discovery isn't ancient history. The doctrine of discovery is operative within our law today, right now at this very moment. So I know that you've been reading the Delgamuukw decision. And so the Delgamuukw decision sets out a test for how Aboriginal peoples can get Aboriginal title to their territory. And it was all over though, because it ended up being sent back for a new trial. Right? So we had this statement of law. It wasn't exactly clear how it was going to be applied though, because it wasn't applied in that case. It got sent back for a new trial, and so it wasn't binding. However, in 2014, we have the Silcotin decision, which essentially affirms all of Delgamuukw, and so now we have clear binding precedent from the Supreme Court of Canada as to what an Aboriginal nation has to do in order to successfully assert Aboriginal title to their territory. So we have a four-part test, and the first part of the test says that the Aboriginal nation has to show that at the time that the Crown asserted sovereignty, they occupied their land in a way that was sufficient and also exclusive of other peoples, and in some cases that they've done so continuously. The key here is that at this first step, the onus is on the Aboriginal peoples. In other words, we start from an assumption that Aboriginal peoples do not have Aboriginal title, and it's only if they meet this hurdle of passing this test and showing that they occupy the land in a way that is sufficient and exclusive that they're able to acquire title. The assumption that we do start with, though, is that the Crown has underlying sovereignty. The Crown doesn't have to prove that. The Crown doesn't have to prove anything. That's just a basic starting point. We just start with that assumption. So this in itself is the doctrine of discovery operating, right? If the doctrine of discovery was not operative within our law, what would our law look like? If it was not operative, we would just start from the assumption that Aboriginal peoples have Aboriginal title over their territory. That would just be the assumption. Perhaps the Crown would need to pass a test to show that it is entitled to have some control over some territory somewhere, but that's not how the law works, right? The onus is on Aboriginal peoples in this test, and that's because the doctrine of discovery is operative. So it's not just a historical curiosity. It is the legal justification for Canada's sovereignty right now at this very moment. And so we are absolutely entitled to critique it on the basis of today's standards and today's values because it's a current doctrine that's operating now. Okay, so what about equality? So the concern was that Aboriginal rights seem to be something extra, something special that Aboriginal peoples have over and above what everyone else has. I hope it's clear by now that Aboriginal rights are not something extra or special, that they're the opposite, that they're the leftovers, that they're a very minimal right that Aboriginal peoples have after the rights of sovereignty have been erased. And if we're concerned about the principle of equality, our concern should really lie, of course, with the doctrine of discovery. That's what's violating the principle of equality insofar as it's based on the assumption of the inferiority of Indigenous peoples. Okay, so what can we do about this now? Well, the doctrine of discovery is premised on erasing the laws, the norms, the values, and the sovereignty of Indigenous people. So if we want to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, we can give effect to the laws, the jurisdiction, and the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. Miigwech, thank you.
Surely there are. Karen, are you happy to negotiate
Sure.
the relationship with the questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
You talked about Treaty 9.
Yes.
Now, Treaty 9 includes the area where Chief Spence is?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And those are gold mines.
Yes.
And those gold mines, part of those gold mines are owned by De Beers of South Africa and the Canadian government. And that's, I don't know really what the, I know that when the Aboriginals agreed to be part of all of this, that when they read the fine print, they discovered that they didn't have the educational qualifications to get any jobs there. So, what's the outcome that's happened with Chief Spence and her trial there?
I don't know the latest in terms of what's happened specifically with Chief Spence. That's a great question, though.
I have a question, and this is based on my memory of what I read of the Decolonize decision. I guess about Terranolius and the Doctrine of Discovery and what's said there, where the judge says that Terranolius has never applied and points to the Royal Proclamation.
Yes.
And you're saying, but the Doctrine of Discovery is Terranolius.
Yes.
And so there's an example of a Supreme Court decision that says, even this isn't our explanation, which I guess is why that's such an important decision. And I'm just hoping you can sort of speak a little bit more to that and how.
Yeah, absolutely. I had that paragraph there and then I just thought it was too long and too much, but I should have left it out. It's paragraph 69 in the Silcoty decision. And what the Supreme Court says there, the unanimous Supreme Court, is they say that the doctrine of Terranolius, that the land was empty when Europeans arrived, never applied in Canada. And then they cite the Royal Proclamation as their authority. And so when so many of us read that, we were like, wow, if only you could make it so just by saying it, right? If only that were really true. And John Burroughs, who we were talking about earlier this evening, has written exactly that in an article. If only writing that sentence on a piece of paper somehow made it true. So what this indicates is that the Supreme Court is really uncomfortable now with this notion that the Doctrine of Discovery is our explanation for our sovereignty. And they don't want it to be the case. Okay, but why do they say that? Why do they actually make that statement? So I said that there have been different versions of the Doctrine of Discovery applied throughout different periods of time and in different geographical areas. So for instance, in Australia, the version that they applied is that upon Europeans arriving, indigenous peoples were left with absolutely nothing, right? No rights, not even the strand in the bundle of rights of being able to use the land and being able to occupy it. They're left with nothing whatsoever. And so essentially what the court is saying is that that version never applied in Canada. That's all they really mean. That's all they can say. Because it's absolutely the case that the Doctrine of Discovery and Terranolius applied in Canada insofar as that's how the Crown can claim to have underlying title without having to meet any tests, whereas Aboriginal peoples have to meet a test to get Aboriginal title. So they're saying we've never applied Terranolius in the sense that Indigenous peoples were left with a right to occupy and a right to use their land, which became Aboriginal title. So there's a sense in which we weren't saying that the land was completely empty because we still give you this Aboriginal title right. But the right of Aboriginal title, of course, is far removed from an actual right of jurisdiction and actual right of sovereignty.
Yeah. I'm wondering about the conditions for the definition of conquest.
Sure. Sorry, I really like that animation feature.
I just wondered, like, it's titled through legal requirements of conquest, and then the source is from something by Shannon. Like, is this, what kind of status does this definition have?
Yeah, great question. So Corman has basically taken a number of international law decisions and international law precedents and summarized them together into a test. So instead of giving you, a whole slide full of sources, I've given you the one source that's done the synthesis. But you could go to Corman's work and see the,
Right, okay.
the primary
So
sources. Yeah, the primary source material that she was working with, which are international law decisions.
I'm just not wondering about number one, a state of war must exist. I mean, it's almost fallen out of fashion to have a state of war. Now you have a war, and how solid that is. It's just so nebulous now.
Yeah, so I didn't look at this in the context of current law because I was interested in what was happening at the time when Britain would be making assertion of sovereignty over Indigenous peoples, right? So I was looking at around the time of 1763. So in terms of currently, how can you currently use this doctrine? I would not be a good authority to help explain that. That being said, there are a lot more requirements to the notion of a state of war than what I got into. So part of that is a debate as to whether the war that you're in is a just war. In other words, were you an antagonist in the war without provocation? I didn't get into all of that. And so there's a dispute as to whether that is even an actual requirement legally of doctrine conquest.
Thank you.
There's competing questions back there.
No, well, might just follow up to that, and then you can have your question. But in order for conquest to ever be declared in Canada, according to this definition, then you're saying Canada would have to then declare war against Indigenous peoples, right? And obviously, and so even thinking about whether or not this is it's maybe out of fashion, but it's certainly not going to happen here, right? It's never going to happen that Canada's going to blatantly declare war. So, you know what I mean? That requirement's never going to be met.
And legally, it can't be met within our common law system for the reason that I gave, which is that our law is built on the notion that Canada has this territory through discovery. And so Indigenous peoples are subjects of the Crown. They're Canadian citizens according to Canadian law.
Right.
And the Crown cannot engage in conquest against its own citizens.
Right.
Conquest is something that only happens against other nations. And so even if Canada engaged in military activity over Indigenous peoples, and even if they did physically subjugate them, it wouldn't legally be a conquest. It might de facto be an exercise of control, of physical control, but it wouldn't legally be a conquest.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could revisit your conclusion. At the end, we understand that the racist doctrine of discovery is the ongoing, persistent law of the land. I understood that you were suggesting that we could rebel against that or resist that by essentially acting as if it weren't. Is that kind of the implication of your conclusion? And I'm wondering if you could kind of color in that picture more what that looks like to do so.
Yeah, great question. And I mean, this is always the key question after I give this talk, which is, yeah, but what do we actually do on the ground, right? How do we actually bring about reconciliation? And my first answer is always, it's not up to me to tell anyone how to do that, that it's up to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And again, we need to avoid a pan-Indigenous approach, so different Indigenous nations will have different visions and different responses as to what it means for them to Canada to decolonize within their territories. But just the logical consequence of what I've been talking about would be recognizing Aboriginal title over Aboriginal territory without Aboriginal peoples having to go through some hoop, to jump through some hoop in order to be able to assert that title. In other words, Indigenous peoples having control over their traditional territory. That's step number one, arguably.
I have a related question, but first I just wanted to thank you so much for being here. And as someone who is coming to Canadian law, or I guess any study of law, after I finished school, sort of, it just feels like this whole world of different protocols and linguistic meaning that I'm used to working with in my media studies background. So I just wanted to thank you both for giving this talk and for doing it in such a clear, precise way. It feels really refreshing to have this laid out in a way that I never got to see in my undergrad and graduate and second-graduate and all that nonsense. So first of all, thank you. And I guess my second, I just wanted to follow up on that question by asking, I guess, what role do you see teaching Indigenous law and Aboriginal legal protocols playing in this question of decolonizing and promoting reconciliation? Because as you mentioned at the onset, some of the texts you're working with are coming from Indigenous legal scholars, and the fact that there now is this push to indigenize academies and to actually have kind of research chairs funded by the government for Indigenous law, I think is a really amazing step forward. But I guess I'm curious, like, how that works. How can you do your own practice, but also on a bigger level, how can scholars teach and sort of work with Indigenous legal practices when you're already working within a system that still supports Indian territorial laws?
Okay, yeah, that's a huge question. No, but I mean, there's so many things to say about it. I guess I'll just start talking and see what comes out. So, after the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action, call to action number 28 focuses on law schools in particular. It calls on law schools in Canada to have a mandatory course on a number of topics, and one of which is Indigenous law. And so there are quite a few law schools in Canada now who have taken this up. And I've worked at two of them. So I started at Lakehead's Faculty of Law, where we just came into existence in 2013. And from the outset, our curriculum included, so in law schools, there's a number of mandatory courses. It's all the key common law courses like constitutional law, criminal law, property law, contracts, torts. But in addition to that, we included Indigenous law as a mandatory course in the first year, along with all the other traditional courses. And I taught that course for 4 years. And then I moved to Osgoode, and Osgoode has just adopted a mandatory requirement as well. Instead of having just one specific course, we have a basket of courses, and students must each take at least one of those courses in order to graduate. And one of them is Anishinaabe Constitutionalism, which I teach as well. So in terms of like, what is this accomplishing? I'm hoping that's going to accomplish a few things. So when Aboriginal peoples have gone to court to try to assert their rights under Section 35, especially when it comes to Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title, one of the things that happens is what I described here, which is judges who, none of whom are Indigenous, so there's never been an Indigenous judge on the Supreme Court of Canada, ever, bring to bear a Western lens, because that's all they have. They don't know how to step outside of it. They don't know how to work within a different legal framework and a different constitutional vision. And when they do that, they bring to bear all of the assumptions I talked about. So this Lockean notion of labor and of what it means to interact sufficiently with the land. Right? So I talk about that as a political theory, but I also teach property law, and that is very much influencing the common law's notion of what it means to truly possess land. And that becomes part of Aboriginal title. Right? So in order for Aboriginal peoples to get Aboriginal title, they have to occupy the land in a way that's sufficiently intensive and frequent. Right? They have to, and if they do things like build a permanent structure, that's the best way they could do that. That's as intense and as frequent as they could be. However, that directly contradicts the laws of at least some Indigenous people, for instance, the Anishinaabe, where the land isn't something to be exploited, it's not an object, it's not a resource, it's your relation. And so if you leave the land to regenerate and ensure that the land is healthy to support your other relations, like the Hook Nation, the Fish Nation, all of the other animal nations, then you're upholding your laws. And so basically, Canadian law penalizes Indigenous people for complying with their own laws. I want people who are eventually going to be judges to see that conflict and to see how unjust it is. And they'll never see it until they get inside an Anishinaabe perspective. So that's one of my hopes.
Thank you for your time. In reading the Silcotin decision, something that's stuck out for me was the words culturally sensitive reading. And that to me seemed to really condition the decision that came about. I was just wondering what the trajectory of that kind of thinking within law, when did that start to come up? The framing that you're presenting us with is actually there's multiple worldviews, and the law itself is governed by those cultures. How's that happen?
Yeah, so this notion of the judges have an obligation to take a culturally sensitive approach to assessing Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights. I think the first time we see that is a decision called Marshall and Bernard, which was also an Aboriginal title decision, but in that case it was the Mi'kmaq lost. They weren't successful. And basically what the court is saying is that when we assess whether the occupation of Aboriginal peoples is sufficient in order to get Aboriginal title, we need to not just look to the common law, they say we also have to look to the Aboriginal perspective. And they start talking about that in Marshall and Bernard, and then in Silcotin they develop it further. And they say that the Aboriginal perspective includes the laws of Aboriginal peoples. And they don't really develop it because they don't have to, because in Silcotin the trial judge found in favor of the Silcotin Nation, and so the Supreme Court just affirms that, and they don't really have to do their own analysis. They just basically say, we agree with what the trial judge said. They have title over these specific claimed areas of their territory. But there's a kind of door that's left open. So I've given a pretty negative critique of the test for Aboriginal title, but there's this little door that's left open. There's a way in which what the court has written could be interpreted in a way that is more favorable for Aboriginal peoples. So what they say is that the test for Aboriginal title is contextual. In other words, it's not that every Aboriginal people has to occupy the land in exactly the same way. By saying it's contextual, they mean it depends on the kind of land it is, what the land is good for, and also some other factors. And this isn't surprising. This is just how property law works in the common law. So for instance, if you've ever heard of squatters' rights. So again, I teach property law. Squatters' rights are really a thing. They're actually a thing in Canada. You can get title to someone else's land just by adversely possessing it for long enough, for real. Okay, but the way that you do that and what you have to do is you have to occupy that land in a way that's sufficiently intense and sufficiently frequent. But how intensely you have to occupy it, how frequently you have to occupy it, depends on the context. It depends on what kind of land it is, what it's good for, what would you naturally use that kind of land for. And basically it's the same question in the Aboriginal title context. But when it comes to the contextual analysis for Aboriginal title, in Silcotin, the court adds in another factor. So not just what the land is good for, but Aboriginal laws are also one of the factors that goes into the contextual analysis. And they never quite say what that means. But logically, what it could mean is that we have to look at what the Aboriginal people's own laws say about how they can use the land. And if their own laws say we can't use the land, right? We have to leave this land empty for certain periods of time, even for years at a time. We have to not go on this land. Then by doing that, by not going on the land, that would actually mean that they sufficiently occupied it. That's my view of how there is a potentially more satisfying approach to the Aboriginal title test. But so far, we don't have any application of that.
This might be too vague a question, I hope not, but in Decolonize and in Silcotin, the comments come up that Aboriginal people have to prove that they are preserving the land for future generations.
Yes.
This seems to come up over and over and over again, and I'm wondering, in non-Aboriginal court cases, does this come up? Do I have to prove that I'm preserving the land for my grandchildren? I don't seem to ever have read that anywhere.
So not if you own the land in fee simple, which is the standard way in which Canadians own land. If you have some condition attached to your land, or if what you actually own is a life estate and someone else holds the remainder interest, then you do have some obligations to the person who holds the remainder interest. Most people hold land in fee simple though. It mostly doesn't come up. So this is very unique to Aboriginal peoples, this notion of inherent limitation to the use of their land, that they can only use it in a way that preserves the benefit of the land for future generations. And the reason why it comes up in Aboriginal title is because unlike property interests for the rest of Canadians, which are interests held by individuals, or else it could be co-owned, like you could co-own your land with your spouse, or whoever else you want to co-own with, I guess. For Aboriginal peoples, the land isn't held by individuals, it's held communally. It's held by the entire community. And the entire community isn't just who exists in this moment. The community includes the future generations. And so for that reason, there is this obligation to preserve the land for the future generations as well.
There's huge inequality in that.
Yeah, so on the one hand, some people argue that, or it could be argued that there's a sense in which that inherent limitation is consistent, at least with some Indigenous perspectives, for instance, the Anishinaabe perspective, the notion that our community, our relations, are not just who exists now, it's also all aspects of the natural world are members of our community, also all of our ancestors are members of our community, also 7 generations going forward are members of our community. And so the decisions we make, we always think about all of our relations, including 7 generations going forward. That being said, others have argued that the limitation is, and that it's actually not based on any precedent. So if you look back to those paragraphs in Delgamuuk where Justice Lemaire starts introducing that limitation, he doesn't cite any authority. He doesn't say what his source is for it. He goes on for 3 or 4 paragraphs. He's literally just making that up there in that spot for the first time. So I owe that observation to Professor Darlene Johnston. She's the one who has articulated that critique. Yeah.
I'm from the West Coast, and I have watched the development of the Tsawwassen territory, given since 2009, I think is when they got their treaty, when they got the right to their land. I don't know what term we use. And I wonder if the way, I know that they have developed huge tracts of land out there, and a lot of housing that would be sold not to the Tsawwassen Nation, because that is quite a small nation, but would be sold to settlers. And my understanding is that the property rights that those people will have will be land lease as opposed to fee simple. Is that right? So I'm just wondering, I guess my bigger question is, and maybe this is an unfair question, but I'll ask it. In reading around about the history of treaties and stuff in BC and the negotiations that have taken place since 1973, it seems like the Tsawwassen are, there seems like there's a judgment of what they're doing, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts about it, or if that's, and I'm reading, it seems like there's this polarization between the coastal and interior nations anyways, it seems like, in terms of the decision about whether or not they want to engage in treaty negotiations at all. But I haven't, I've been in an outsider reading it, so I wondered if you know about that or have any thoughts about it in terms of property law for them, but also in terms of the relationship, the different choices that the interior are making versus the coastal people. Yeah.
I can't say that I know the specifics of their particular agreement, but I can talk, generally. So do I understand correctly that the critiques or the concerns are that the nation should not be giving these leases to non-Indigenous people or non-members of their nation? Is that the concern, or?
I mean, it's, the critiques have not been really spelled out, and so I've been wondering if somebody knew more about it from an inside perspective, because it's like been something I've sensed, because they haven't been held up as an example, the way Shuswap has, or the way certain nations have been held up as examples in BC. They're never mentioned in the literature, or at least what I've read so far, as an example of a successful treaty. And so I've been wondering why that is, because I've been watching it take place whenever I go back to visit my parents. So it's just been something I've been curious about. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I can't speak on that with any authority or any inside knowledge.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay.
There's a whole issue out there right now about Aboriginal women that divorce and that they have no entitlement to the property. Where's that going?
Yeah, so we finally did have amendments to legislation to address that issue. That's not something that my research focuses on, but my understanding just from hearing others who are dealing with that is that even the amended legislation is still considered to not fully address the problem and still considered to be deficient. So the legislation is only a few years old, and so we're still seeing it play out. But I think it's a continuing issue to watch as to whether it does provide more protection for Indigenous women.
And when you look at the history that the Indigenous woman, before the colonizers came, they were the matriarchs of the family, and that the men came to them for decisions. Yet as they were colonized, they sort of shifted, and the men, the Indigenous men, took complete control and put women in the back seat, and have not wanted them to be back in the focus where they really have the good control that they had prior to colonization.
Yeah, so different Indigenous nations have had different governance structures. My understanding mostly focuses on the Anishinaabe nations, and based on what I've heard from elders, the way that governance worked prior to any contact with Europeans was in a very bottom-up kind of way. So it started with families, right? So say there's a decision to be made in the community, that every family comes together and everyone in the family has an opportunity to be part of the decision, even children. And of course, women as well. Why wouldn't they? Everyone is involved. And then someone from the family is designated to come together with the rest of the community, and they form a council. And together, they bring forward all the perspectives from each of the families. And then that council does the same thing in terms of decision-making processes. And then the different communities, again, they send someone from each council to come together. And so it's this very bottom-up approach. That's my understanding from an Anishinaabe perspective. And so from that perspective, women have all the same ability to contribute to governance, as men do, of course, and even as children do. Yeah. So I have a question for all of you to think about, but we can make it the last question if people are tired. But so I just mentioned children, but what about, there are a couple places in my talk where, for instance, Sir William Johnson refers to the Anishinaabe as children, and then Duncan Campbell Scott says that he told the First Nation signatory to Treaty 9 that the king is their great father. So could it be argued then that this is actually a way of articulating to the First Nations that there is going to be a relationship of subjugation, but just in language that they can understand, right? A language of hierarchy of the father at the top and children below. So is that, so maybe that undermines my argument, perhaps. Any thoughts on that? Oh, sorry, you haven't had a chance yet.
No, you go.
I think that we're only undermining the argument if we apply kind of Western understanding of the family in the future. And what I've read of Michael Ash's reading of Treaty 4 and Indigenous interpretations of that kind of language wouldn't undermine your argument at all. That would be my response.
Yeah,
And
and
that's
that,
what you're suggesting.
and that's how it's been explained to me as well. So I mentioned Professor Darlene Johnston, and she's explained this to me and elders as well. So of course, within a Western perspective, the notion of a hierarchy with parents and then children, and if we even want to bring in a Christian interpretation, we have God, then the Father, then the Mother, then children, then animals, then plants, then like rocks and stuff, right? We have this complete hierarchy. And so if we are only immersed within a Western perspective, it can be easy to assume that everyone's going to have that same hierarchical perspective between parents and children. But it very much is not part of an Anishinaabe perspective, right? The hierarchy is not part of the worldview. Instead, we should think about the relationships as being a network or a web, not in a hierarchy. And that children are not considered to be somehow inferior to parents or to have less to contribute. And if we think about it in terms of gifts and needs, it's true that children do have more needs and parents have more gifts. But what that means is that when you put yourself in the role of a parent, what you're really saying is that I have more obligations to you, right? That you are almost in a more powerful position to call on me to fulfill my obligations from an Anishinaabe perspective.
So in that context, does that apply to the Great Father then? In Treaty Number 9, that, well, certainly at that time there were more material goods that the settlers could provide, so would the Anishinaabe have seen it in that light?
Absolutely, the Anishinaabe would have seen it in that light. Would Duncan Campbell Scott have understood how they saw it? I couldn't say, and probably not. Would Sir William Johnson have understood that when he was saying children, that actually he was saying that you can call on me as having more responsibilities to you? He might have, because Sir William Johnson was married to a Haudenosaunee woman, Mary Brandt, and there are indications that he actually really did understand an Indigenous perspective. And I mean, I guess I'll just, I'll just stop there.
I have to say that the name Duncan Campbell Scott was very bad taste in my mouth. And he, like Canadians, to let him go down in history as a wonderful poet. But I think he really was the perpetrator, the biggest perpetrator of residential schools. And, it's an intergenerational problem that the Indigenous population is dealing with. We can all take it back to Duncan Campbell Scott and his policies.
Right, so I only mentioned his role as a commissioner of Treaty 9, but of course he had a very significant role to play in maintaining the residential school system. That's important to note.
Karen, we have a gift for you before you leave, but it pales in comparison to the amount of gratitude I feel, and I'm sure is shared among the rest of us in the room for your generosity and your clarity, and so most of your time. So thank you very much for being here.